Welcome back, everybody, to part 4 of this fantastic series that I've been enjoying so much from Extra History, OTTO von Bismarck. We are now going to get into the wars, I would imagine, is what's coming next. The Schleswig-Holstein War, the Second Schleswig War, I guess it is. The war with Austria, and probably the Franco-Prussian War. I don't know if we'll get to all that in today's episode, but I'm ready to dive in. Real quick, just one thing. Every so often I get people suggesting that I play games on this channel, so you may or may not be aware that I've actually had a historical gaming channel for the last 4 years. This channel grew out of that one. So if you're interested in historical gaming, strategy gaming, things like that, there's a link in the description that will take you to History Guy Gaming, which is my historical gaming channel. Would love to have you subscribe. There's daily content that goes up there, just as well as the daily content that's going up here. So let's dive into part 4 of Bismarck.
It is go time in Bismarck land. Bismarck had a list, and he was checking it twice. Action item number 1 on that list: steamroll some Danes. 16 years prior, in 1848, Prussia had invaded Denmark with the hopes of annexing the largely German-speaking duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, but the threat of international intervention had sent them packing. Now it was time for revenge, or at least a very pragmatic seizure of territory. You see, the Danish king had just cacked it, and as basically always happens when a European king checks out, his death left everybody scrambling over the succession. And in this case, that scramble was played out between one staunchly Danish branch of the family and one sympathetic to the Germans. When the Danish group won out, they decided that it was high time to rule Schleswig and Holstein directly.
So the guy who wins out eventually in that is Christian IX, who becomes king of Denmark. And Christian IX, just as Queen Victoria is known as the grandmother of Europe, Christian IX is known as the father-in-law of Europe. And he is an ancestor of pretty much every royal family today in Europe. In fact, he's a direct male line or agnatic ancestor of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, which means that when Charles and William become king of the United Kingdom, they will be direct male line descendants of Christian IX. So I think Philip is a great-grandson of Christian IX. So a lot of history there, even though it's a small nation comparatively speaking, but Christian IX has a lot of ties to all these other countries. But in the meantime, he's got to fight a war, the Schleswig War. And it wasn't a real big war in terms of the numbers involved. If you think about the might of the Prussian army, I think they only sent 60 or 80,000 men into this war. And the deaths were relatively small. The entire war, which lasted less than a year, the deaths were smaller than the deaths at Antietam, for example, in the American Civil War.
To finally incorporate them into the Kingdom of Denmark, not to leave them as semi-independent duchies with their own weird rules and privileges. This violated a treaty the Danes had signed with the Prussians, though, and gave Bismarck his chance. But it also made things tricky. After all, if Bismarck used ideas of liberating the oppressed and defending smaller nations' rights to justify invading Schleswig-Holstein, he'd have to find a really good reason for sticking around to occupy those places himself, instead of just leaving again.
So my understanding is, and there's actually a lot of parallels here between Bismarck and then Adolf Hitler generations later. This is really about uniting the German peoples. And Schleswig and Holstein, though they're Danish, they have a lot of German heritage there. And so you actually get the Austrians fighting on the side of the Prussians in this war, which is interesting because just a few years later they're going to be at war with each other.
He had been setting up these dominoes for a while, though. There would be no repeat of the last time when they had to flee due to other powers coming in on the side of the Danes. He had already secured the friendship of the Russians, and made vague promises to the French that they might see some territory out of the whole deal if Prussia was allowed to absorb Schleswig and Holstein. And without Russia or France, Britain would protest, but they'd never actually go to war on the Danish side. He had also suckered in Austria, convincing them that they were all on the same side. Germans defending Germans and all that. He even convinced them to be allies and contribute a horde of troops to the effort.
So there is the importance of good diplomacy. And you can see how he got all his ducks in a row. before he felt confident enough to be able to go into this war without angering people and getting retaliation from them. That was the difference between this war and the First Schleswig War, is that Prussia didn't have those assurances and those alliances.
And this is key. Not only did he need Austrian troops to secure a quick victory, but it would also make them complicit. If, after they won, he said that Prussia was going to take territory, the Austrians wouldn't walk away without their share, which not only meant that European public opinion wouldn't turn against Prussia, but also meant
Prussia.
that he wouldn't lose the moral high ground in the German Confederacy. And his plan worked perfectly. The combined Prussian-Austrian forces rapidly overran Denmark. The Danes had to grant the independence of Schleswig and Holstein. Bismarck made some ludicrous demands, and the Austrians, not wanting to be left out, eventually caved to a compromise that left Bismarck exactly where he actually wanted to be.
And that's another brilliant negotiating tactic. You demand far more than you actually expect to get or that you actually even want, knowing that then granting you what it is you really want will seem like a compromise. It's really well done.
Prussia would keep Schleswig, the Austrians would get Holstein, and he would get a small pile of other minor concessions to boot. But Bismarck was always a man of large appetites. He didn't come all this way to only get Schleswig. And so, part 2 of the plan commenced.
Yep.
Operation Make Fun of Austrian Incompetence. He played up everything that went wrong in Holstein, and talked openly about it being a breeding ground for revolutionaries. His sound and fury brought the two nations to the brink of war, but both of their monarchs wanted to avoid such a conflict between brothers. Wilhelm accepted the possibility of war, but forbade Bismarck from explicitly goading the Austrians anymore. But Bismarck's work on that front was already done. He had a backup plan in case war didn't come. Bismarck always had a backup plan.
He always had a plan. He always had a backup plan.
But he spent most of his time trying to shore up alliances, to make sure that Prussia was ready for the fight his king sort of didn't want. First, the Italians. Victor Emmanuel, the man trying to unify Italy, desperately wanted to take over Venice.
So that's an interesting point to make here, too, is that while Europe is in the midst of all of these revolutions, Europe's also in the midst of people trying to consolidate territory. Remember, Italy hasn't existed as a nation. It's been a conglomeration of states just like Germany has. Up at least till this point, there is no Italy. There hasn't been a unified Italy since the Roman Empire existed.
Which was in Austrian hands. I mean, how can you have an Italy with no Venice? But he was never going to have the strength to fight Austria alone, and so Bismarck seized on this, getting him to agree that if Prussia and Austria went to war, the newly formed Italian kingdom would join in for only the small price of one Venice, which Bismarck didn't really want anyway.
So, again, this is good diplomacy on Bismarck's part. He's getting what he wants and not really giving much up in the process and gaining an ally. And this actually is a similar strategy to what backfired on the Austro-Hungarians in World War I, because Italy was kind of a free agent going into World War I. And it was kind of up in the air which side they would join. Would they join the Central Powers? Would they join the Entente? And it came down to this area Triol, which is kind of the northeastern part of modern Italy. And they wanted that from the Austro-Hungarians. And if Austria-Hungary had been willing to openly promise that to them and say, okay, you can have that territory, they might have been able to get Italy on their side, but they weren't willing to do it. That's what Bismarck is willing to do here with Venice.
Next, the French. While not publicly successful in securing the French as allies, Bismarck was dealing with Napoleon III here, a man too clever for his own good by half.
So, isn't this interesting, as you're foreshadowing a little bit here, that Bismarck is making alliances with people that he darn well knows he's going to be going after in the near future. In the Schleswig War, he gets Austria on his side to fight in that war, and then immediately when they win the war, turns on Austria once he's accomplished what he needed them for. Now, he's getting France, Napoleon III, on his side as he lines up the dominoes to take on Austria, knowing full well that when he's done with Austria, then he's going to go after France. He played these people like a fiddle.
Napoleon III, who saw himself as the equal of his famous uncle, but really wasn't, took the only course of action that would get him nothing. He wouldn't support Prussia, but he wouldn't support Austria either. This was just fine by Bismarck. Finally, Bismarck kept pressure on Austria, having Prussian officials meet with Romanians and Magyars, Czechs and Serbs, any ethnic minority within the Austrian Empire.
So Magyars are Hungarians. Magyar is actually the word for Hungary. So that's what he's talking about there.
All in order to make it look like he was building allies and raising legions of revolutionaries ready to revolt the moment the Austrians went to war. But Bismarck's plans were interrupted by one thing he did not factor in. As he walked down the great boulevard Unter den Linden, 2 shots broke the quiet. He whirls. A young man stands before him, revolver in hand. The 51-year-old Bismarck grabs him. 3 more shots ring out as they grapple. Finally, soldiers run up and subdue the young man. As the assassin is hauled off, they check Bismarck for wounds. One finds a hole in his coat, and follows it to find a hole in his waistcoat, which, with some trepidation, he follows to find a hole in Bismarck's shirt. All 5 shots had hit, but every one of them had either only grazed him or bounced off of his ribs.
So when you talk about iron, when you talk about Bismarck, iron flesh too, apparently.
In a moment that history doesn't record, but I think we all know happened, Bismarck simply nodded to the soldier, said, "Iron Chancellor," put on shades, and walked away.
That is so cool. He's so cool. He really is. I can see a lot of parallels here between this dude and Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, the president of the United States, who gets shot and says, "Oh, hey, by the way, I just got shot, but I'm going to go ahead and finish the speech." Yeah, this is so totally in keeping with this guy's persona that he did this. And yeah, so whether it happened or not, I totally believe it happened.
Refusing to let one measly assassination attempt get in the way of a good war, Bismarck went right back to work getting the German-speaking world to tear itself apart. And as rumors swirled, the Austrians felt they had to make a move, so they called the Pan-German Diet in Frankfurt to decide the issue of Schleswig and Holstein. The Diet moved against Prussia, but this played right into Bismarck's hand. The moment the Diet came to their decision, the Prussian representative read a statement that Bismarck had prepared for just such a moment, declaring the Diet invalid and the German Confederation dissolved. Now it would be war. It would be the northern German states and Prussia against the southern German states and the Austrian Empire. Hundreds of thousands of men were mustered. It could have been a long war, but now the king had in his service a general as capable on the battlefield as Bismarck was in the conference room, General Maltkey. The uncle of the General Molden who will so disastrously lead the German forces into the First World War, this Molden could not have been more different from his nephew. He was one of the first to see that the modern rifle had made the idea of the frontal charge obsolete.
Something that a lot of countries, even a generation later, hadn't figured out yet. So this is really forward thinking in terms of understanding, but that by this point in world history, rifled guns and the ammunition that went with them made guns so much more accurate and had to change how you did things on the battlefield. This is what they discovered in the American Civil War, just right around the same time, is that you can't mass troops in a solid line and march in open country anymore. That's why by the end of the American Civil War, things had devolved into trench warfare, especially in the East, because they had figured this out.
He grasped the importance of railroads for mobilization and realized that modern armies were too big to be commanded by one man, that plans should be flexible and subordinates should be allowed to take initiative within them. It was this Moltke who famously said, "Plans never survive contact with the enemy." Moltke led a lightning war, crushing the once great Austrian Empire within weeks. And now, where Bismarck had once had to work so hard to get the king to go to war, their success had been so great that he had to work equally hard to get the king to stop. Bismarck realized that they could only push so far before the other great powers stepped in, and all of the work that he had done would be undone.
A lesson that Adolf Hitler didn't learn. Hitler pushed and pushed and pushed, and the international community largely appeased him until he went too far with Poland. This is something that Bismarck understands here. He understands when not to push any further.
More still, he believed that once he had eclipsed them, he might need the Austrians to serve as a balance against one of the other great powers, so he must not impose on them a peace that would leave them hating Prussia.
Again, you see the parallels here between this and the aftermath of World War I. Don't punish somebody to the point where you make an enemy long-term out of them. He understood that even though he defeated Austria, Germany still needed Austria because they were a natural ally. And so he didn't humiliate them in the settlement.
So Bismarck called in his erstwhile enemy, the Crown Prince, the same Frederick Wilhelm who he had so unsuccessfully tried to put on the throne as a toddler, and put him to work reining in his father. Fritz, a lover of peace despite being an excellent military commander, convinced the king to accept the deal that Bismarck had on the table. Prussia would take over most of northern Germany. The German Confederation as a body would be disbanded. Their Italian allies would get Venice, and Austria would forever be banned from any pan-German parliament, or from meddling in German affairs. Oh, and weirdly, Liechtenstein became an independent country, so that also. All in all, things were looking up for Bismarck's grand project of uniting all of Germany under Prussian rule. There just loomed one more obstacle, one great nation that, although neutral so far, would oppose any further increase in German unity and strength. There was the problem of France.
All right, so we are going to get into the Franco-Prussian War next. So I would love to hear your thoughts about all that. Let's continue this conversation. I've really been enjoying it so far. So we've got a couple episodes left, I think, of this. And then we'll be looking at probably looking at some other channels. I've had a lot of suggestions over on Discord of things I can do some reactions to. I'm going to be editing this afternoon my video on Stonewall Jackson and his mortal wounding at Chancellorsville from that site. So you can be watching for that probably tomorrow. In the meantime, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, check out my gaming channel, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks for watching.